What happens when a single border decision suddenly turns a heavily militarized Russian enclave into a strategic island overnight? And more importantly, could this moment mark the quiet beginning of a far larger confrontation between Moscow and the NATO front line? The shock began spreading across Europe when Poland moved to shut down what remained of Russia's practical land access routes, linked to Kaliningrad, Moscow's most sensitive outpost on the Baltic Sea. While the decision appeared administrative on the surface, diplomats and military analysts immediately recognized it as something far more consequential. Kaliningrad is not just another Russian region. It is a forward-deployed military hub packed with missile systems, radar installations, and logistics infrastructure that directly threaten NATO's eastern flank. Any disruption to its access reverberates far beyond local politics. The original timeline shows that tensions had already been escalating for months. Rail sabotage incidents, suspected intelligence operations, and repeated accusations of Russian hybrid warfare had pushed Polish security agencies into a heightened state of alert. According to Polish officials, the move was framed as a defensive response to what they described as persistent hostile activity linked to Russian intelligence networks operating under diplomatic cover. Moscow immediately denied the accusations, calling the decision an act of political aggression rather than security enforcement. Yet behind the diplomatic language, the strategic reality was stark. Kaliningrad depends heavily on land transit through neighboring NATO states for civilian goods, industrial inputs, and even some military logistics. Cutting or restricting those routes transforms the enclave into a logistical liability rather than a strategic advantage. Western analysts noted that this vulnerability has long existed, but had never before been tested so openly during an ongoing major war. At the same time, the broader regional picture added fuel to the crisis. Ukraine's expanding campaign against Russian energy infrastructure inside Russia had already strained Moscow's domestic logistics. Power substations, refineries, and fuel depots deep behind the front lines were increasingly targeted, forcing Russia to divert air defenses and repair resources away from the battlefield. In that context, pressure on Kaliningrad did not emerge in isolation. It landed at a moment when Russia's overall logistical system was already under stress. For NATO, the implications were equally serious. The Suwalki Corridor, the narrow stretch of land between Poland and Lithuania, has long been viewed as the alliance's most vulnerable choke point. But recent developments suggest a reversal of that logic. Instead of NATO fearing isolation of the Baltics, Russia now faces the risk of its own forward base becoming strategically boxed in. Defense analysts in Washington and Brussels quietly acknowledged that the balance of pressure in northeastern Europe may be shifting. Under the current U.S. administration, led by President Donald Trump, Washington has publicly emphasized deterrence without direct escalation. Official statements stressed alliance solidarity while avoiding language that could be interpreted as preparing for immediate military confrontation. However, behind closed doors, Western officials reportedly viewed Poland's actions as a test case for how far NATO states could push back against Russian gray zone operations without crossing into open conflict. Economically, the ripple effects were immediate. Transport firms reported delays, insurers raised risk premiums, and regional trade planners warned that uncertainty around transit routes could disrupt supply chains linking northern Europe to Asia. Kaliningrad's civilian population, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, faced the prospect of higher prices and shortages, an internal pressure Moscow could not easily dismiss. Russia's response, at least initially, remained measured. The Kremlin signaled it would pursue diplomatic and legal avenues, while state media accused NATO of engineering an artificial crisis. Yet analysts noted a clear dilemma: escalate and risk triggering broader NATO involvement, or absorb the pressure and watch a key strategic asset lose its deterrent value. Meanwhile, as energy strikes continued inside Russia and NATO's eastern defenses quietly hardened, the question was no longer whether Kaliningrad mattered, but how long Moscow could afford to defend it under mounting logistical and political strain. What followed next shocked analysts even more as the confrontation shifted from borders to shadows. The confrontation did not escalate with tanks or missiles, but with fragments of steel scattered along a rail line, silent evidence of a battle unfolding in the shadows. What investigators uncovered next reframed the crisis not as a border dispute, but as an intelligence war playing out across Eastern Europe. And the question quickly emerged: was this sabotage an isolated act or a warning signal ahead of something far larger? The original sequence of events pointed to a carefully timed explosion along a key railway artery used for both civilian freight and strategic transit. Polish authorities stopped short of publicly naming a culprit, but officials described the incident as professionally executed, designed to disrupt traffic without mass casualties. That distinction mattered. It suggested intent, not chaos, and immediately raised suspicions of state-linked involvement. Within hours, counterintelligence units were deployed, and Poland's internal security posture shifted from precaution to active containment. According to information later cited by Western media, investigators began mapping connections between the sabotage and individuals previously flagged for intelligence activity under diplomatic or commercial cover. While hard evidence remained classified, the pattern mirrored earlier Russian hybrid operations documented across Europe since the early phases of the Ukraine war. Cyber intrusions, infrastructure probing, and deniable physical actions had become familiar tools, each calibrated to stay just below the threshold of open conflict. At the same time, the broader strategic environment was deteriorating. Ukraine's strikes against Russian energy facilities were accelerating, forcing Moscow to prioritize domestic security over external projection. Western analysts noted that this created incentives for Russia to respond asymmetrically elsewhere, especially in regions like Poland and the Baltics, where NATO sensitivities are high, but escalation risks remain manageable. The rail incident fit that logic uncomfortably well. Poland's response was swift and deliberately public. Security briefings emphasized resilience, while legal measures tightened oversight of foreign missions and logistics hubs. The shutdown of remaining Russian-linked facilities was framed not as retaliation, but as risk mitigation. Warsaw made it clear that hybrid threats would now be treated as strategic threats, not criminal anomalies. For NATO, the implications were sobering. Intelligence sharing channels lit up as alliance members compared notes on similar incidents. Defense planners quietly reassessed assumptions about critical infrastructure vulnerability, not just railways, but ports, energy nodes, and data cables. The lesson was clear: modern confrontation does not begin with troops crossing borders, but with systems quietly failing. Washington's posture under President Donald Trump reflected this recalibration. Public statements avoided direct attribution while reaffirming alliance commitments. Behind the scenes, however, U.S. defense officials reportedly pushed for expanded counter-hybrid coordination, arguing that deterrence now depended as much on intelligence resilience as on firepower. Russia, for its part, rejected all allegations accusing Poland of manufacturing threats to justify political pressure. Yet even sympathetic analysts conceded that Moscow's denials did little to reassure neighbors already alarmed by years of documented covert activity. The credibility gap widened, and with it the risk of miscalculation. Meanwhile, as rail lines were repaired and security tightened, a deeper shift became apparent. The confrontation was no longer about transit alone. It was about visibility, access, and the ability to operate unseen. And in that contest, Russia appeared to be losing ground faster than expected. Yet the most consequential development was still ahead, as attention turned from disrupted tracks to the skies and seas around the Baltic, where another layer of pressure was about to emerge. Meanwhile, what unfolded next would strip Moscow of something even more valuable than logistics awareness itself. If rail sabotage signaled disruption, the next phase struck at something far more sensitive: perception. The Baltic theater began to change not through explosions, but through the quiet removal of eyes and ears and intelligence blackout that analysts say may prove more damaging than any physical blockade. So how does a military power operate when its situational awareness begins to erode? As investigations expanded, Polish and Allied security services focused on what they described as dual-use infrastructure facilities and platforms that appeared civilian but carried clear intelligence value. Communications nodes, port-adjacent offices, and logistics monitoring points were suddenly placed under scrutiny. Several were shut down or stripped of access, a move that Western officials framed as routine security enforcement, but which effectively narrowed Russia's visibility across the Baltic region. The original timeline shows that this shift followed weeks of heightened NATO intelligence coordination. Data sharing increased among Poland, the Baltic states, and the United States, with a particular emphasis on maritime traffic, airspace monitoring, and undersea infrastructure protection. The Baltic Sea, already crowded with surveillance assets, became even more tightly watched. For Russia, this meant that movements once considered routine naval transits, radar calibrations, supply shipments, were now exposed or delayed. This loss of transparency mattered deeply for Kaliningrad. The enclave's military posture relies not only on missiles and troops, but on early warning systems and rapid decision-making. Analysts at Western defense institutes noted that without reliable intelligence coverage, even advanced weapons lose much of their deterrent value. A missile force that cannot clearly see potential threats risks either paralysis or dangerous overreaction. The timing was especially problematic for Moscow. Ukraine's ongoing strikes against Russian energy infrastructure continued to force reallocations of air defense systems. Radar units and interceptors that might otherwise reinforce Kaliningrad were being pulled back to protect refineries, power plants, and fuel depots deep inside Russia. This redistribution thinned Russia's layered defenses in the Baltic, just as NATO's situational awareness was sharpening. From NATO's perspective, the shift represented a strategic gain without firing a shot. By tightening intelligence control and reducing Russian observation capacity, the alliance effectively raised the cost of any aggressive move. Western experts emphasized that deterrence in modern warfare is increasingly about denying an adversary reliable information, not merely threatening retaliation. The U.S. role under President Donald Trump remained cautious but deliberate. While Washington avoided dramatic announcements, defense officials quietly endorsed enhanced surveillance cooperation and resilience measures across Northern Europe. The message was subtle: NATO would not provoke escalation, but it would not tolerate blind spots either. Russia's reaction followed a familiar pattern. State media accused NATO of preparing an information blockade, while officials warned of unpredictable consequences. Yet behind the rhetoric, independent analysts suggested Moscow faced an uncomfortable reality. Restoring lost intelligence networks would require either diplomatic concessions or riskier covert actions, both difficult options under current conditions. For civilians in the region, the changes were barely visible. Ports still operated, ships still moved, and borders appeared calm. But beneath the surface, the strategic environment had shifted decisively. Control over information had begun to tilt westward, altering calculations on all sides. And as awareness narrowed and pressure mounted, attention inevitably turned to the most vulnerable piece on the board, the isolated enclave itself. Yet what came next transformed Kaliningrad from a symbol of power into a potential strategic hostage. The strategic map of northeastern Europe suddenly looked very different. What had long been portrayed by Moscow as an unsinkable forward bastion now began to resemble a pressure point, one that could be squeezed without a single NATO soldier crossing a border. Kaliningrad, once a symbol of Russian reach, was increasingly discussed in Western briefings as a liability. But how did an enclave built to intimidate NATO become so exposed so quickly? The original timeline highlights a structural weakness that had always existed but was rarely tested. Kaliningrad's military strength depends on uninterrupted access by land, sea, and air. As land routes narrowed and intelligence visibility diminished, reliance on maritime and air supply surged. Yet those routes too were under constant observation in the tightly monitored Baltic Sea. NATO naval patrols, surveillance aircraft, and satellite coverage meant that every movement in and out of the enclave was now tracked with unprecedented precision. Western defense analysts noted a psychological shift inside Moscow's strategic planning circles. The Suwalki corridor, long viewed as NATO's Achilles heel, was losing its centrality. Instead, Kaliningrad itself was emerging as the more fragile node. Any attempt by Russia to force open land access risked triggering Article 5 scenarios, something the Kremlin appeared keen to avoid under current conditions. Compounding the problem were Russia's internal pressures. Ukraine's sustained attacks on energy infrastructure had forced the Kremlin into costly trade-offs. Air defense systems were redeployed to protect power plants and refineries, reducing the margin of safety for outlying regions like Kaliningrad. Repair crews, spare parts, and fuel were stretched thin, and logistics planners faced the challenge of sustaining a heavily armed enclave, while domestic infrastructure came under repeated strain. For NATO, the situation presented an opportunity, but also a risk. Western officials stressed restraint, emphasizing that no blockade had been declared and that international law was being observed. Yet the strategic effect was undeniable. Kaliningrad's deterrent value was eroding as uncertainty replaced confidence. Analysts warned that isolated forces are more prone to miscalculation, especially when command and control clarity weakens. The United States, under President Donald Trump, continued to emphasize stability while quietly reinforcing alliance cohesion. Military exercises were calibrated to signal readiness without provocation, and diplomatic channels remained open. The goal, according to Western officials, was not to humiliate Moscow, but to demonstrate that coercive leverage had limits in a connected, surveilled battle space. Inside Kaliningrad, the civilian dimension added another layer of complexity. Reports of rising transport costs and supply delays began circulating, fueling public unease. While far from crisis levels, these pressures underscored how quickly strategic decisions can ripple into everyday life, an uncomfortable reminder for the Kremlin that control over distant territories comes with real costs. As Kaliningrad's isolation became harder to ignore, the broader question shifted from whether Russia could defend the enclave to whether it could afford to. Meanwhile, as borders tightened and routes narrowed, the economic shockwaves were only just beginning to surface. The strategic squeeze soon translated into something far more tangible: money movement and momentum. As border controls hardened and uncertainty spread, the economic dimension of the crisis moved from background concern to central pressure point. What had begun as a security response was now reshaping trade routes, insurance markets, and regional planning across Northern Europe. So how far could economic friction go before it altered political calculations? The original timeline shows that the first warning signs emerged quietly. Freight operators reported longer processing times, rerouted shipments, and higher compliance costs. Insurers reacted even faster, raising premiums for cargo transiting near the Baltic and flagging Kaliningrad-linked routes as elevated risk. None of these measures constituted sanctions, yet together, they created a chilling effect, slowing flows that once moved with relative ease. For Russia, the implications were layered. Kaliningrad has long functioned as both a military outpost and an economic gateway handling transit goods, energy-related components, and regional trade. As access tightened, supply chains grew less predictable. Western economists noted that even modest delays can cascade, quickly increasing costs for consumers and eroding confidence among investors already wary of geopolitical exposure. The timing again proved unfavorable for Moscow. Ukraine's expanding strikes on Russian energy infrastructure continued to absorb financial and technical resources. Repair costs, mounted export revenues faced pressure, and budget planners confronted difficult trade-offs between domestic stabilization and external commitments. In that context, sustaining an economically isolated enclave became more expensive by the week. NATO members, meanwhile, framed the developments as an unintended but unavoidable consequence of heightened security. Officials emphasized that no deliberate economic warfare was underway. Still, alliance analysts acknowledged that economic leverage had become an increasingly powerful byproduct of defensive measures. By tightening oversight and reducing risk tolerance, NATO states were indirectly shaping Russia's cost-benefit calculations without issuing ultimatums. The impact extended beyond Russia and Europe. Logistics experts pointed to potential disruptions along broader Eurasian transit corridors, including routes linked to China-Europe trade. While alternatives remained available, uncertainty around the Baltic added friction to already strained global supply chains. For multinational firms, predictability, not ideology, was the deciding factor, and predictability was in short supply. Washington's approach under President Donald Trump remained consistent with earlier signals. Publicly, U.S. officials avoided triumphalist language stressing de-escalation and economic stability. Privately, Western policymakers viewed the situation as evidence that strategic competition in the 21st century increasingly hinges on infrastructure finance and resilience rather than troop movements alone. Russia's response oscillated between defiance and adaptation. State-linked companies explored maritime workarounds, while officials accused the West of weaponizing trade norms. Yet even sympathetic observers conceded that these alternatives were costlier and less efficient, temporary fixes rather than durable solutions. As economic pressure accumulated, analysts began asking whether Moscow might seek to relieve the strain through negotiation, or whether it would double down on asymmetric responses elsewhere. Yet as markets adjusted and borders hardened, one final shift loomed, one that would redefine NATO's Eastern posture for years to come. The final transformation did not arrive with headlines about closures or sabotage, but with something more enduring: concrete doctrine and force posture. As uncertainty hardened into a new normal, NATO's eastern flank began to shift from reactive defense to structured long-term deterrence. And in that shift, the balance of pressure subtly but decisively changed. So what happens when a temporary crisis starts rewriting permanent strategy? The original trajectory shows that Poland's response evolved rapidly from internal security measures to broader defense planning. Border protection, infrastructure resilience, and counter-hybrid capabilities were folded into a single framework aimed at denying coercive leverage altogether. Military planners emphasized redundancy, multiple routes, backup systems, and layered defenses designed to absorb shocks without cascading failure. The lesson from Kaliningrad was clear: resilience itself had become a strategic weapon. Across NATO, similar thinking took hold. Exercises in the Baltic region were adjusted to prioritize mobility, rapid reinforcement, and protection of critical nodes rather than large-scale maneuver warfare. Western analysts noted that the alliance was quietly adapting to a world where gray zone pressure is constant and escalation management matters as much as raw firepower. The eastern flank was no longer a tripwire, It was becoming a fortified network. The United States, under President Donald Trump, supported this recalibration while maintaining a careful public tone. Official statements highlighted alliance unity and deterrence, avoiding language that could lock Washington into automatic escalation. Behind the scenes, however, U.S. defense planners reportedly viewed the developments as proof that NATO could impose strategic costs on Russia without crossing red lines, a model they believed could be replicated elsewhere. For Moscow, the picture grew more complex. Kaliningrad remained heavily armed, but its strategic utility was increasingly constrained. Analysts pointed out a paradox: the more militarized the enclave became, the more expensive and politically sensitive it was to sustain. Isolation magnified risk rather than reducing it. Any attempt to break that isolation by force would almost certainly trigger a wider confrontation, something Russia appeared keen to avoid while already stretched by war and internal pressures. Energy dynamics continued to weigh heavily. Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy infrastructure showed no sign of slowing, keeping domestic vulnerabilities in focus. Western experts argued that this combination, external pressure on logistics and internal strain on energy systems, limited Moscow's room for maneuver more than any single sanction package ever had. For NATO, the strategic payoff was tempered by caution. Officials repeatedly stressed that stability, not humiliation, remained the objective. The alliance sought predictability through strength, signaling that coercion would fail while dialogue remained possible. It was a delicate balance, one designed to deter without provoking. As the situation settled into an uneasy equilibrium, one conclusion stood out. The crisis had not produced a dramatic clash, but it had reshaped assumptions on all sides. Power in the Baltic was no longer measured only in missiles or battalions, but in access, information, and economic resilience. And with those foundations shifting, analysts began asking a final unresolved question: was this the end of escalation, or merely the quiet opening of a longer strategic contest?